Hi, I'm Henry Hollander for Der Nister, and I'm here today with Rabbi Aryeh Cohen to talk about his book, Justice in the City, which is a really interesting book that introduces active logic for social justice from the Jewish textual tradition. And I'm not gonna go into a long introduction for him because I'd rather hear some of that from him directly. So why don't you tell us sort of your sort of the secret origin of your social justice approach to Jewish texts.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me here.
Thank you very much.
Beautiful downtown Der Nister. So this book and in a certain way, this book represents and reflects a certain part of my life that is the coming together of two streams of my life, both my dedication to traditional texts, Talmud and Rabbinics mainly, and also dedication to social justice. So I grew up in the Orthodox world. I was, Orthodox, and then I became more Orthodox, and then even more Orthodox, until I became less Orthodox and became conservative at a certain point. It's a whole other story, a whole other program. But I was very much involved at the same time, and when I was in high school, back in the Neolithic times, in the 70s, in the Soviet Jewry movement. And I was that and some activism around the State of Israel very early on convinced me that when there are problems, what you do is you organize, and you go out in the street, and you try to advocate to elected leaders, and if not, you create mass movements. And
So this was stuff you were doing when you were high school in New York?
This is stuff I was doing when I was in high school in New York. I was in a rather Orthodox high school, Chamberlain, and it wasn't actually then in the ultra-Orthodox or Haredi or Yeshivish world, activism for Soviet Jewry even was not considered appropriate. What was appropriate was they would have, gatherings to say Tillim and things like that, but not, politics, not going out on the street and having demonstrations and marches and sit-ins and walkathons.
So this was Orthodox, but it was not in the Hasidish world?
It wasn't Hasidish. It was definitely not Hasidish. It was Yeshivish. There was those who know will tell you that there actually, Chaim Blin, there's an overlap with Ger Hasidim, but that's a whole other conversation. But Chaim Blin was it was definitely in the Yeshivish world. So I was there for 2 years. We had a parting of the ways, as it were. Then I went to Chavetz Chaim in Forest Hills. The only memorable thing about Chavetz Chaim was that it was actually situated in a Reform temple where Art Garfunkel had his bar mitzvah. But I was in that world. I did not learn in that world about activism. I did learn at the times that I did not spend in school.
So they definitely did not associate themselves with the larger, American activist.
No, and this was the time, if you remember, this was 1972, 73, 74 is still the end of the 60s. And so there's the countercultural protests, beginning of Black nationalism, Jewish Defense League, and Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry was somewhere in the middle there. It wasn't the Jewish Defense League, but it wasn't the Central Conference on Soviet Jewry. It was the anti-establishment student movement for Soviet Jewry. So we were the ones who we were, whereas the JDL was throwing firebombs and breaking windows and sitting in the Russian embassy. We were sitting in on the streets, and we were having davening mincha opposite the Russian embassy downtown. So it was there was a fluid kind of movement between the two.
Yeah, when I was in that era, when I was in USY, we did some things like that, and we actually like invited in some of the Refusnik kids who had come out, who had settled where we were. So like it wasn't like being in New York or Washington where you could really go and address the Soviets. This was like,
right, and it was also, I mean, it was interesting. There are now some people who are going back. There's some good books that are being written about this period of time, both on the American scene and internationally. Some rethinking about some revisionist history about what part this played in the Cold War, because it was Henry Scoop Jackson, who was a hawk, who actually was very important to the Soviet Jewry movement, because he passed some bills in Congress which put pressure on the Soviet Union, despite which went against the détente that was then happening.
Yeah, it sort of put a little like some right. anchors onto the détente
exactly,
process.
And it also crisscrossed with Israeli interests, because the Israelis were not interested in people emigrating from the Soviet Union coming to the United States. And they tried to pressure Bruno Kreisky from Austria to stop people coming, to not allow people into Austria as a transshipment place to the United States. Not transshipment, but they go stop over on their way to, but rather only to go to Israel. There was pushback in the United States against that amongst the Jewish community and ultimately the American government. So it was kind of, looking back on it, it was interesting. For me, personally, and there's also, the JDL is just recently, Shaul Magid wrote a book about Meir Kahana and how he was very active and used the Soviet Jewry movement as leverage. He decided that was his platform. He could have owned the Soviet Jewry movement if not for the fact that then they went out and they killed somebody in the JDL, and so that kind of put a damper on his reputation. But he organized one of the largest Jewish demonstration in Washington, D.C. It might have been the largest demonstration in Washington, D.C. up until that moment, 100,000 people around Soviet Jewry. So as a high school kid, growing up with that, and with the images of Vietnam War anti-war demonstrations in Woodstock in the background, and very much remembering the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. I grew up in an atmosphere, even though I grew up in an Orthodox home and went to yeshivas, in an atmosphere in which political activism seemed to be a very prominent thing. Now, I didn't really know what that was. I knew, we would go out and collect money for the Students' Royal Soviet Jewry. We'd go out, we'd go to a demonstration, Then I went to Israel, excuse me. And there I lived in Israel for 12 years. I made Aliyah as an Israeli citizen. It's a whole other story of going from the political right to the political left. When I got to Israel, I was very much on the right.
So you did military service?
I did. I fought. I was in tanks, and I was in Lebanon in 1982, where I witnessed firsthand and up close the total disaster of the war in Lebanon. Some of my very good friends were killed in Lebanon in 82 because of this disaster, because of specific intelligence mistakes, and also because of larger lies that Ariel Sharon had told Menachem Begin, which precipitated Begin's resignation, Sharon's ultimate, for other things, conviction. Not conviction, but he was, the Khan Commission said he couldn't be a minister anymore in the government, which lasted about 5 minutes. And but that was a period in which I was given, and I finished yeshiva, finished my army service at the same moment in 1982. The war was in June, and I got out of the army in the end of July. I started university in September, and I was in the States in between. So university in Israel starts after the holidays, so it's anywhere from September to the end of October.
It was just more practical that way.
Right. So I took the time at the university. I was very fortunate that I did not let my coursework get in the way of learning something at Hebrew University. I spent a lot of time both in the library and also with friends and talking, and spent hours in drinking coffee and really rethinking a lot. And so that was the beginning of my rethinking. And so my political activism there was partially, which ultimately led to this, was the realization that in Israel at that time, textual interpretation was a real battlefield around, for between right and left, right? What is the true interpretation or legitimate interpretation of text, of the tradition, right? So on the one hand, on the right, it was Torah Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, Am Yisrael, that there's this trinity which could not be separated of the Torah of Israel, the land of Israel, and the people of Israel. And on the left, with equal vehemence, claiming that that trinity is not a trinity. It's not locked bound to each other. That there are more. It might be a hierarchy, and the hierarchy is Am Yisrael, Torah Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael. That the people, that to have peace is more important than the land of Israel. And so that was and it was all about textual interpretation, which was mind-blowing.
So who were sort of the intellectual leaders in those?
So on the the intellectual leaders were on the left were I was very fortunate in that I was in Gush Etzion. I did Hesder. I learned in Yeshivat Har Etzion for Hesder, and even though I am very far away from them politically now, but I was very much influenced by.
Sorry, just say what Hesder is.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hesder is a program. Hesder literally means an agreement. And the Hesder was an agreement between the army and a number of yeshivot that were Zionist yeshivot, that the yeshiva boys would be both in the army and in yeshiva. So they would spend half their time, more or less, a little less in the army, more in the yeshiva, but spend half their time in the yeshiva, half their time in the army. And that way they could be part of, in their understanding, be part of building the land, and also keep up Torah, keep up learning Torah, keep alive the learning of Torah. So Rav Amital, who is the head of Yeshivat Har Etzion, yeshiva that I went to, he died within the last decade. Who himself was, his story was amazing. He used to say to us, he was born in Hungary. He's a survivor of Shoah, a survivor of Auschwitz, came to Israel, and a couple of years later he was a commander in the Haganah fighting at Latrun. He used to say at Israel Independence Day celebrations, if somebody would just screen all the memories I have as a movie, nobody would believe it. Right? So he was kind of an amazing personality. And he was one of the leaders of Gush Emunim. Gush Emunim is this right wing, literally means the block of the faithful. And it was they're the ones who led the settlement movement after 1967 to settle in the occupied territories. At a certain point, it took a long time, but at a certain point, by the time, by the time the peace agreement with Egypt was being signed, which was 1977, he was already saying that the Gush Emunim folks, the Block of the Faithful, these folks who were do the settlement movement and settling in Hebron and settling in other places, they might have once been an avant-garde. But you can't be an avant-garde if you are so in front that nobody could see you anymore. And so they've lost touch with the people. And Rav Lichtenstein, who is the other head of the yeshiva, he said early on in the early 70s that for peace I would move the yeshiva to Tel Aviv. Not clear that he stuck to that throughout his whole life, but at the same time, the yeshiva was created in 1771, and it wasn't a very large yeshiva during the Yom Kippur War, but the Yom Kippur War was a tremendous defeat, even though ultimately a victory, but tremendous defeat for the Israeli army. And lots of guys were killed. So Rav Amital took that very much to heart because these were his boys. And that would be echoed in the 82 war, in the Lebanon war, where he was asked on national radio about the plan to encircle and then enter Beirut during the war. And his reply was, Ariel Sharon doesn't have a right to kill my boys because he wants to go into Beirut, right? So this was all, right? This was very personal for him. And it was also, he was a survivor and he was building this empire, not empire in a bad sense. He was building these grand institutions of Torah
even from a right-wing position, Beirut is not part of historical Eretz Yisrael. It's like, why do we need to be here?
So he was not swayed by Sharon's imperial designs. He was not swayed by that at all. He wasn't swayed he was very much a Zionist and very committed to what he saw as the defense of Israel, but he was not at all swayed by the swagger of the army, by the swagger of Israeli power. He was modest. I mean, there are ways, I could talk about him and Rav Lichtenstein they had a partnership. They had a true partnership. And which is almost unheard of in the yeshiva world, where you have two people who are co-equal, who are, every once in a while, Rav Amital would say, okay, he'd say to Rav Lichtenstein, okay, Rav Aaron, it's time for me to resign. And Rav Aaron would say, okay, I'll resign also. And actually, they continued this tradition where now they have 3 Roshei Yeshiva. And so it wasn't a dynasty that was given up, even though one of Rav Lichtenstein's son and Rav Amital's son-in-law, but also Baruch Gigi, who's a Mizrahi student. So the 3 of them have a Vad who run the yeshiva. So it's kind of, there's a lot of things that are very impressive about it. At the same time, it is in historic Alon Shvut, which was a kibbutz before 1948 and was uprooted by the Jordanian army. And
that was Gush Emunim's program is this is what we lost, and we're going to go and we're going to reclaim it.
But Gush Emunim's program is way beyond that. Is that Gush Emunim's program is the real land of Israel.
But like in July of '67, they're like, we're going to go do this right today.
Right,
and they did.
Yes, they actually started. What people forget is that they started in the Golan and not in Palestine, and they started in the Golan Heights. The first settlements in occupied territories were secular kibbutzim in the Golan Heights. Gershom Garnberg has written a wonderful book about it called Accidental Empire, and he has on his website he has a bunch of the documents. But Gush Emunim's point was the real land of Israel is in Judea and Samaria, in Shechem and in Hebron and all these places where that we read about in the Bible, right? So therefore we have to go there and not in Tel Aviv,
So
Ra'anana.
But you have like a contradiction between this sort of ideology and then the desire for peace as well.
So that's what happens. So thank you. Thank you for getting us back on track. So there is this tension between peace and the greater land of Israel, right? And the question is, which way do you resolve that tension? What happens is that from the right, over the years, and this is happening in the States now, the value of democracy is denigrated, is lessened. And in Israel, it's also the value of peace is lessened. It's like, oh, peace. It's like, there'll be peace when, Pax Romana. There'll be peace when we defeat everybody and when everybody's dead. And on the left, they're saying, no, look at the value of peace in the prophets and in the tradition. And the value of peace is actually ultimate, and the value of war is not ultimate. And we're not, so that was a real struggle over the tradition. That very much also influenced me. Because I left Israel in 1988, which was just when the Intifada, the first Intifada broke out, which was a very depressing time because I thought I'd been involved in a lot of religious secular dialogue. I'd been moving gradually to the left on Israel-Palestine, and And I thought that things were happening. And then I realized, no, nothing's happening. It's like, if you listen to the Palestinians, they're telling you, nothing's happening. You might be talking, but you're talking to yourself. And here we are still, and Rabin is still saying, break their wrists, break their bones.
Yes. Well, this is a very interesting conversation that you're having, but
right,
exactly. But it has no impact on me.
And that is exactly, those almost exact words were what happened when we had dialogue groups with Palestinians, and the Israelis were all in, mainly, this is academic groups, graduate students or undergraduates, who and talking about history and how to interpret history, and the Israelis were all interested, and there are two sides, there are different truths, and the Palestinians at a certain point would always say, look, you could babble as much as you want, but your babbling is not helping anybody in the refugee camps in Palestine, and so we're gone, we're out of here, right? And that was before the Intifada. And the Intifada was when we realized how much more they understood than we understood, right? Because that was the Intifada showed us that, and the Intifada, it broke out because the way these things broke out, it's, there was an accident, there was something happened, like the second Intifada broke out because they went up onto the Temple Mount. It's not that all of a sudden there was this, suppressed rage. King said that riots are the voice of those who don't have a voice, the voice of the voiceless. And so we realized how wrong we were, or some of us realized how wrong we were. And so that's when I came back to the States. At the end of the 80s, and to a certain extent, I was part of this organization called Netivot Shalom, which was a religious Zionist peace movement in Israel, and which was actually a kind of a radical movement, which was kind of a tectonic shift, because it was the first peace movement that was based on religious youngsters. There'd been an older movement. There'd been a movement of kind of older religious, yekes, that people came from Germans who, but they were very docile. And here, they were all mainly immigrants and of an older generation. This was a group of officers in the army, right? Like Moshe Halbertal. You asked me who the intellectuals were. It was Avi Ravitsky, who was a professor of philosophy at the university, Moshe Halbertal, who I knew from Yeshivat Har Etzion, but he hadn't been a Hesdernik. He had been in the Air Force, and he would go on to get a doctorate and be world famous for all kinds of things in the intellectual world. All these folks who were making a claim, who were saying loudly, we are Bnei Akiva. We are the next generation of religious Zionism, and we're saying that religious Zionism should be headed towards peace, right? And Rav Amital spoke at the first convention of Netivot Shalom. And so it was a big kind of tectonic shift. You could feel the ground moving, because the right, the Zionist right, the religious Zionist right, could no longer claim for a monopoly over what it meant to be a religious Zionist. Shai Leibovitz was in the audience, and there was an interesting exchange between him and Rav Amital. Rav Amital made a speech. Shai Leibovitz didn't speak, but Rav Amital was making a speech and saying that what he wants out of this movement was that people could still retain their Zionism while working for peace, and that he was afraid that if the only option is Gush Emunim, is the right, then people would leave. And then he said, and I hear that people are no longer saying about, in the Grace After Meals, people say that Israel is Reshit Smichat Gulatenu, that Israel is the beginning of the flowering of the redemption. And so which is essential Rav Kook. Yeah. So he was saying, so Rav Amital said, and I hear that there are even people who are stopping to say that. He was saying the scandalous tone. And Shai Leibovitz from the audience screams out, and they shouldn't say it. And Rav Amital goes on and says, and despite what Professor Leibovitz says, they should say it. Which was also just kind of cool from the previous generation of this living debate between these great folks. So I came back to the States in 88. I came back to the States to do a doctorate at Brandeis in Talmud, Jewish philosophy. I went to we moved in. We were living in student housing. This is just a funny aside. I went to the student housing office because I had experience in Israel. It took me 4 years to get a telephone. So I figured, having learned Israeli mores, I figured I'd go into the student office and demand my telephone right away. And I say, it's really important. It's, I have family. I have to get in touch. Blah, 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 blah. I'm going on and on for like 15 minutes. And the woman says, well, I'm really sorry. I don't know what to tell you. I can't get it to you till tomorrow morning. So that was my welcome back to America.
I don't know whether it was before deregulation or not.
Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, so coming back to the States, at first I was part of the American Friends of Netiv Shalom. Every group has an American Friends of. We spent most of our time trying to get enough people together so that we wouldn't be thrown in jail for having a 501c3 without having any members. I don't think anybody's ever been thrown in jail for having a 501c3. But and on Israel Independence Day, I'd spend...
Zach and I had a discussion about this with a lawyer who told us we'd be okay.
Yeah. So I also, I would spend, for a few years, my biggest political activity around Israel, I'd go to the Israel Independence Day Festival and spend 10 hours being screamed at because I was for Israel, and because I was for peace, right? At a certain point, I realized
when I was at the interview for American Jewish University for Ziegler for the Rabbinical program, I got the sort of question about where are you on Israel, and I gave this really long convoluted answer, and I can't. Maybe it was Rabbi Artson or one of the other bigwigs. You weren't there, and they were like, we don't really understand. And I said, I support Israel, not prime ministers. And the response was, okay, and they moved on. That was a satisfactory answer. That really was all the explanation that was required.
Right. Right. I mean, things have evolved since then. Things are not now as they were then in terms of where Israel is. I would not be in the Netiv Shalom now. I wouldn't be. There's a whole evolution of Zionism I wrote a piece for Daily Beast, How I Lost My Zionism. And that had to do with Israel. It had to do with the fact that the Zionist movement was supposed to, the goal of the Zionist movement was to create a safe refuge for Jews and to build a state, where Jews can come and live. And so they did that. And so the fact that, the World Zionist Organization in Israel has a banner on its house that says, Hatzionut tinatzeach, the Zionists will win. How much winning do you want? It's not winning anymore. Now it's occupation. And so now the challenge is to create a democratic state.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is kind of the problem of you build up a political organization on one really significant issue, and when you succeed, it's hard to pivot onto what's the thing you do afterwards. It's much more comfortable to stay in the mindset that you'd always been in. And sometimes,
right.
Sometimes what happens is, the central organization that carried you through to sort of succeed on that one issue, it needs to get you to stay in that ideology, because maybe it's time for another organization to come in leave the next issue. And so
it's not so much about. I don't think it's so much about organization. I think it's about governments and states. And
well, a state is an organization too.
A state is an organization, is an institution. So So anyway, so at a certain point, I realized that I was living in a whole other country after coming back to the United States, and that there were actually things that were happening in the United States that were of political significance, and not only in Israel. And I turned my attention to what was going on in the United States. I think the first big issue that I organized around was the first Iraq War. And so part of, student coalitions, blah, blah, blah. I was a graduate student. We created a little Jewish organization, try to have a Hanukkah action on a very windy night in Boston, trying to light candles, and we didn't have a miracle. but that kind of turned my focus and realized that I didn't want to, that, Israel-Palestine is a seriously important issue, and I have strong opinions about it, but I do live in this country, and in this country there are serious issues that are happening. And so, and I finished my doctorate, and there was Oslo, there was the end of Oslo, there was the assassination of Rabin. There were a lot of things that were showing me that Israel was going in the seriously wrong direction, and that supporting Israel, at a certain point, I realized later, but at a certain point, I realized that what I used to say, which is, I support Israel, but I support it to do X. I support a peaceful Israel. I support Israel. The reason I'm for peace is because I support Israel. I realized that, at a certain point, you have to set up, there has to be a red line. I mean, when do you say, no, maybe I don't support Israel? And so I think Israel crossed those lines for me. It's not that I'm anti-Israel, but I am anti a lot of things that Israel is doing now. I mean, I don't know what it means to, just like I don't know what it means to love a country, I don't know what it means to be anti a country. Israel exists. I mean, most of my days I'm not delusional, though you might want to argue with that. So Israel exists, and there it is, and Israel has responsibilities and obligations in the world.
You generally seem like a practical person.
Right, thank you. When I moved out to Los Angeles to accept a sinecure at the venerable University of Judaism, which then later on became the American Jewish University and the Ziegler School of Rabbinical Studies, 2 weeks after I got here, there was an announcement that the Ziegler School of Rabbinical Studies was going to become a full-blown rabbinical school. And so I was part of the, we set up the curriculum, et cetera, and so forth. At the same time, lots of things were going on, as we were talking about before. Things were changing. It was Clinton, triangulation, trying to be Republican while claiming to be a Democrat. Lots of bad things were happening. And so I realized that I could have a certain voice. And so I started writing. I wrote, the first article I wrote was for Tikkun magazine about after Clinton and had signed off on welfare repeal, which basically was putting women and children out into the streets, cutting welfare, putting work requirements, all kinds of stuff.
Tikkun, I think, in that period was a much more valuable and effective publication than it is now. People who only know it at this point don't really have a sense of it. It actually was very well read, and the Clintons were very
well. There was a moment. There was 5 minutes there when Michael Lerner was an advisor to Hillary Clinton, and then he told everybody he was an advisor, and then he was no longer an advisor. But Tikkun was trailblazing. I mean, that was the thing about Tikkun. It was it created a space. There was no other space like Tikkun in the 90s. I don't know, Ramparts. I mean, it was something like Ramparts, Jewish Currents in the 30s, 40s, 50s.
Yeah, well, Ramparts wasn't that anymore.
Right, so all these things, Jewish Currents wasn't that anymore. Commentary had gone over to the right, right? But in the 50s, it was commentary. But so Tikkun took up this space, and it was a trailblazing space. It was a magazine in which they had an editor who was out loud about Israel-Palestine, that there has to be what we used to call then trade land for peace, two-state solution, out loud about the fact that that economic justice was a Jewish concern, out loud about the fact that racism was a Jewish concern. And that, I think that's, Michael Lerner's legacy is that, I think. Nowadays, the thing is that the truth is that there's lots of other journals out there also. So Tikkun takes a small niche of a larger thing, which also, you have Jewish Currents, you have other journals which are also in the space. And so, it has a smaller voice. But then, and so my first piece was in Tikkun, and because it was the only place you could get it published. It was like the only place that was looking for that and was embracing that. And so that was very important. That was very important for me, but it's also important because the piece I wrote, I called The New Sodomites, which I thought was cute. But it was a piece in which I took ideas that I saw in Midrash and Rabbinics and actually said, you know what? These things could present and formulate a conceptual vocabulary within which we can talk about things that are going on nowadays, right? Things in very in sophisticated ways. And so, the idea of the new Sodomites was that in Ezekiel, when he talks about Sodom, it's talking about greed. It's not talking about sexuality at all. When the rabbis talk about Sodom, they talk about lots of things, but they talk about one of the things they talk about is voracious, idolatrous private ownership of property. And so there is we have a vocabulary here. It's not a one-to-one, but we have a vocabulary here. And so I started thinking about that. I got involved with an organization called the Progressive Jewish Alliance. Daniel Sokach was the ED then. He's now the head of New Israel Fund. And he and I had hit it off really well. And he was an amazing organizer and mover and shaker, mobilizer. And, my first conversation with him was, do you want to create a Jewish social justice movement, or do you want to create a movement for social justice which has Jewish membership? And I said, because if you want to do the latter, we already have the ACLU, right? And he and Daniel, and I don't think it has anything to do with the fact that he was a rabbinical school dropout, but Daniel was very interested and invested in creating a real Jewish social justice movement. And so at the Progressive Jewish Alliance, everything we did had a Jewish framing or grounding. Right? We created together a restorative justice program, which we call the Jewish Community Justice Initiative. And training was, we partnered with Centennial Valley Youth Association, who did the case management, because you had to have somebody who's going to cases where, the way restorative justice works here is for youth, for first or second time offenders. So they could go, they could ask for alternative sentencing. It's under an alternative sentencing model then. And then they would be diverted to, and so you had to have somebody who is going to follow their case, do the case management. So that was beyond our capacity. So we partnered with Centennial Valley. They trained, and we did I think it was 30 hours of training. 20 hours were mediation training, which was great. I actually got a real deep insight into what restorative justice could look like that. And then 10 hours was Jewish tradition and text. I remember the first time we sat around the table with all the volunteers, and 3/4 who wanted to do this training wanted to become mediators, who were going out and mediating shoplifting and vandalism, and kids who, I have a story in the book about, kids whose lives could have been ruined because of their interaction with the criminal legal system, who weren't, right? Who were diverted because they realized that somebody cared about them. And so these people around the table were interested in doing that, and then all of a sudden they have a Gemara in front of them, right? All of a sudden they have Talmud and Midrash, and we went around introducing ourselves the first time, and like one after another, people say, well, the last time I thought about anything Jewish, I was 4. I was in 5th grade. I was, and we also had some people who were, coming from that side and saying, wow, restorative justice, that sounds cool as a Jew. And so, but that was anything. We had a death penalty speakers bureau. And so at a certain point, I started thinking it would be really important, instead of just being reactive. We were very involved in the labor movement. We did, we worked with Unite Here, the hotel workers. PJA did something called, sweatshops called, No Schwitz. I'm sorry, I didn't come up with a name. But I realized that there were lots of issues that we should think about, not just as they come up, right? And so this book was founded. This book
was available at all good Jewish bookstores.
Well, available
We wish.
at all books. It's I don't know how many Jewish books, but it's available. All the places you buy books, you could actually get this book. It's still in print. It's a Academic Studies Press, which is a great small academic press, independent academic press in Boston. But it's also on indie books and.
I sat with the editor one time at the Association of Jewish Libraries conference.
Oh, excellent.
early on in their
He's great.
in their history, to try to figure out what they were up to. I think he probably would have been happier if he was a bit more like Brill. Brill, a very, very high-end academic publisher. But I think it's they've found their niche.
They found a niche, and they have a large array of series and titles. They're very respectable, despite the fact that they published my book. So this book came out of that. We established a think tank, which was unheard of in an activist organization, because the idea was, we should not only be responding to what's going on in the streets, but we should be thinking about what it means to what, from within the tradition, from within rabbinics, and from a city should look like, right? And hence the title, Justice in the City, right? And so we worked on issues in the PJA. We worked on labor issues, homelessness, restorative justice, and so those are the issues that came to the fore and ultimately came to the book. And at the same time, I created the theory of the book was a theory of the just city, was a city which responds to has an obligation to protest, the notion of accompaniment, where we have the boundaries of our obligation are not geographic boundaries.
I'm forgetting the name of the psychology person who dealt with ethics out of the University of Chicago, whose educational program actually is called Just Cities. And I think that Shalchevet uses this as part of the program. So we took a quick break, and we figured out what we were talking about. We were talking about Lawrence Kohlberg of Harvard and the University of Chicago,
And
whose educational application of his theory of the stages of development of ethics was called the Just Communities Program, which locally the Shalchevet School uses as part of their educational program. So anyway, back to what we were talking about.
Unclear what we were talking about. So we were up to. What I wanted to say is
Just Cities.
Yeah, what I wanted to Just Cities, and so the book came out of thinking around that started in Progressive Jewish Alliance. Progressive Jewish Alliance then melded with Jewish Funds for Justice and created together Bend the Arc, where I am now. I'm the rabbi in residence of Bend the Arc. But the idea for the book was to create, as the subtitle says, it's an argument from the sources of Rabbinic Judaism, of creating to out of the source of Rabbinic Judaism. So one of the things that was very frustrating to me is when there were two approaches in Jewish social justice. One was, hey, I'm Jewish, so therefore, and I'm working for social justice, and there are lots of Jews working for social justice, so therefore what I'm doing is Jewish social justice. The other is, okay, let's Judaify or Jewify what we're doing, and so we'll say tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue, and let's make believe that that means vote Democratic and be liberal. And now, there are a lot of other people, aside from me, there's, Jill Jacobs, Shmuel Yankler. I mean, there are lots of people who, back in the day and today, who are doing this work, but what I knew existed was a very robust vocabulary out of which could be constructed a language and a conceptual world which defined what it meant to create a just city. And I was interested in the city because we live in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is an amazing city. It's a sprawling city. It's also as problematic as every other metropolis is. Emmanuel Levinas, who's very influential in this book, who's a French Jewish philosopher, died in the 90s, born in the aughts of the last century, and just spanned all of that history. And he's French. He died in France, born in Lithuania. Jewish philosopher, and he was Jewish also. Very influential philosopher, and he has an essay called Cities of Refuge, which is based on a Talmudic discussion based on the biblical law regulations around cities of refuge. And a city of refuge is intended for people who, as you know, are killed accidentally. So he coined this term, which is that somebody who is...
So anyway, to clarify, the cities of refuge are a place where someone who's accidentally caused the death of someone can flee from the family who have a right to take revenge on them as blood avengers. And if they go to those cities and stay within those cities, the blood avengers can't actually act against them. So it's a like, this is not a standard. A society where blood avengers is an acceptable norm is so far away from where we are, but the biblical tradition is acting to prevent that. It seems like one of these cases where the Israelites are granted something normative in the ancient world, but then it's like pulled away from
it's probably them. It's probably, and one could track this with source criticism and the historical development of the Bible, where you see that this was probably a law or a practice that pre-existed, and then this was a way to deal with it. However, Levinas is much more interested in the metaphorical usage of the cities of refuge, because those who went to the cities of refuge who killed accidentally were objectively guilty but subjectively innocent, meaning that they had actually killed somebody, but they hadn't intended to kill somebody. So Levinas says, essentially, that all of our major metropolitan areas are cities of refuge because all of us are objectively guilty, though subjectively innocent, in the way we decide on our city budgets and what we do with our money and what we let banks do with our money and what we let the states do with our money and what, the way, we live in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles Police Department is the most murderous police department in the country, killing more people than any other police department. That's us, right? And so that's in that situation. As
Rabbi Fenton likes to say about these things, it's not a contest.
Right, it's not a contest, but we won. And so in those situations, we are all, and as Levinas says, who in the West cannot be found guilty for what they did not know about what was happening with their votes, with their resources, with their political actions. And so the notion, Levinas has this notion of being objectively guilty, though subjectively innocent, to say that it is our obligation to be aware. And this is kind of the basic, the cornerstone of the book, is that we have an obligation to hear the cry of the poor. To set, and more than that, not just to hear the cry of the poor, to set our cities up so that we can hear the cries of the poor. Right? We're not worried about those people who hear the cries of the poor and don't care. Right? That's already, but there's another level of we have to be attentive. So Barbara Aaron and I had a great book a while ago called Nickel and Dime, where she spent a year working as a low-wage worker. And one of the things that I took away from the book is that when you go into a grocery store and you're in the checkout line, do you remember that the cashier is an individual human being and not just part of the cash register? Right? I know that for me, that's become a practice, right? Because if the line is slow, do you get angry at the cashier as if the cashier is just part of the cash register and you're just being backed up? And maybe the cashier has had her daughter is sick, or she's trying to figure out how to do childcare. Or he's, just being threatened with the loss of job. All these. So that is the question. What is it that we don't see? Right? And so on the one hand, we have to react to this politically. As we have city budgets, elections. I know that you're very interested in practical things to do. So we're coming up in November. There's really important elections about housing. There's a proposition called Housing LA, which will, with pennies on billionaires' taxes, be able to build affordable housing. There's a proposition to amend the city charter so that the sheriff can be impeached, right? Because our sheriff has been, blatantly violating laws and norms and morality. There are a number of these things you can do, but there's also personal practice, and these things are not disconnected.
We're maybe 2 weeks from Rosh Chodesh Elul, so this is a good time to start to talk about that sort of thing in a more intense way.
Right, and you live downtown. I don't. I live in Pico Robinson. So, but we both have in our neighborhood homeless people who live on the street. And as we were walking here, we passed a woman who asked for some money. I don't have cash on me, but you immediately gave her some money, and that's more. And that's not. And and I know that's not solving anybody's problem.
Because on the day I actually had some money for, I also often don't have the money.
Accept the compliment. You're exotic. But the point is that instinct is not, if we had a conversation, that's not solving a problem. It's solving her, she might be able to eat dinner, which is a good thing. It's not solving the problem. And one should never think that it's solving the problem. But what it does is it says, you are part of my community. You're part of my community. And it's even better, when you have time to sit and talk to a person, to find out what their names are, and the reason for that is to say, you are part of my community. And then when I go to the voting booth and I'm trying to impact city policy, I remember who's part of my community. Right? And there are people in my community who don't have homes, who don't have houses. Right? And we live not far, we're sitting here not far from Skid Row, where there are 5,000 people on the street who don't have houses. And there are certain people who are trying to be their voices, and they are themselves advocating for themselves, but they need to be taken into account when we decide policies.
Well, it's actually important if you're talking specifically about Skid Row, that we have this population that we say, well, there's a certain population of Skid Row, but the population of Skid Row is not. It's kind of the tip of the iceberg, because LA sends a lot of people into this into this area. So like the people may be able to get out of Skid Row, but that population is going to be reinforced and reinforced over time. So like that's it's a special, it's in a way a special case because it's
a special case, but as you said, it's the tip of the iceberg. It shows what's underneath the water, right? And what you said is very important in the sense that there are competing interests, right? So Skid Row is right next to the Arts District, and the Arts District covets the real estate of Skid Row. But there isn't, and while they want to clean Skid Row, and the Olympics are coming up, everybody get out and scream at the top of your lungs, we don't want the Olympics. Everybody, I don't know, where's the camera? Everybody get out and do that. The Olympics, it's going to be a disaster for poor people, for unhoused people. But the folks in the Arts District or the developers who covet Skid Row, they're not building low-income housing or affordable housing. They just want to move this population elsewhere. We need tens of thousands of housing units. So,
well, the arts district is actually, I didn't really understand this. The Arts District is primarily not a residential district. It's primarily a commercial district.
Correct. Yeah.
And the population of the Arts District is smaller than the population of Skid Row. It's about 1,300 people, 1,300 right, yeah, like permanent residents of that area. So it's a bigger place as a commercial place than as an actual neighborhood.
So that's even worse. In other words, so over the years, if you look back at maps from the 70s, 80s, the Arts District was much smaller. It wasn't even, I don't even know if it was called the Arts District then, but it was much smaller. And Skid Row was much larger. And and the question is also Little Japan, it borders on Little Japan. But if we just interact with Skid Row as a blight on the city, right? We have Grand Central Market. And so if we think, which is basically in Skid Row, we have opposite that wonderful building where all these movies were, where Blade Runner was shot.
The Bradley building.
So all these great things. And if we think of Skid Row as just those people who are peeing on the side of the building who have to be gotten rid of, then we're not doing is, first of all, we're dehumanizing them. Then once you dehumanize them, you criminalize them. And so you have this constant churn of, you put them in jail for a week, and then they get out. And if you look at, if you look at what people get arrested for in Skid Row, it's carrying open bottles, it's parole violations, it's not crimes.
Well, it used to be jaywalking.
Jaywalking also, I mean, all these things.
Literally, like that was...
And they use those...
People were getting stopped for that all the time.
Right, and so what the first step has to be is to remember these people are human. They're part of our city. They're part of our community. They need housing, right? And so that's where we have to start, right? Rather than start at, this is a blight on the city. We have the Olympics coming in. People are going to come in from all around the world, and this is what they're going to see. That's what they did in Shanghai. In Shanghai, they just swept everybody out of the city. We can't have that happen there. And so what Levinas was talking about with being objectively guilty but subjectively innocent is that when we're voting on the city budget, when we're deciding where to shop, where not to shop, deciding whether we should use public transportation or not, these are people who have to be part of our considerations, because if they're not, then we are guilty in what happens to them. Right? And so that's the book. I wrote the book in order to create a framework within which we have a notion of an obligation. Right? We have, rather than if, and it's too late to turn back now, but if rather than having a right to shelter, there was an obligation to shelter, right? In international human rights, one of the human rights is right to shelter. But to have a right to shelter, you have to demand it from somebody. So every homeless person has to sue, let's even say the city agree that there was a right to shelter. But if there was an obligation on the city to shelter, the city would have to show cause why they're not sheltering.
Yeah. Well, exactly. This is something which is very problematic for homeless people, where the issue is, even if there are services, how do I find them? If they exist, how do I access them? And things are not necessarily designed for easy access to work well. And the concentration of services in Skid Row is very problematic for Los Angeles as a whole, because it's a very large place, and to tell someone that in your neighborhood, Pico, that they need to go to Skid Row to get services when they're at best on the bus, it's problematic.
Right, and this is something that this is something actually that the rabbinic sources give us, is this notion of obligation. There's an obligation on the city, and this is also goes, and so this is in terms of homelessness, but also in terms of labor. In other words, like we are, there is an obligation to respect the dignity of workers, to pay workers on time, and it goes back to remembering that workers are people. The kind of the core text is this text where God is talking to Moses about Pharaoh, and he says, "Avadaihem," that Israel are my servants, and the rabbis in the Talmud say, "Avadaihem v'lo avadim la'avadim." They're not servants to servants, and they use that as a proof text to say that a worker could decide in the middle of the day that they don't want to work anymore. Right? And this is something that some scholars think was a major revolution in late antiquity, that the only difference between a worker and an enslaved person was that a worker would get a paycheck at the end of the day, but had no rights over his or her work conditions. And the truth is that this was, when you think about company towns, you think about the way that labor was in the United States in the 19th century and up until the mid 20th century in some places. This is exactly it. The only difference between enslaved people and working people is that working people got a check, and oftentimes, in company towns, that check would be, you would end up with a check, right?
It would be script, yeah.
Right. It would be script for the company's store. And so labor also and restorative justice, the basic principle of restorative justice is seeing people as people, is not judging a person by the worst day of their life. And it's centering the harm to victims, not in the sense of, vengeance, but rather in the sense that the way that a victim can heal, well, actually I have to step back because I said that wrong. We have to ask victims, survivors, what they need to heal. And oftentimes what they need to heal is first to ask the perpetrator, why did you do that? And that necessitates a conversation between the survivor and perpetrator, and survivor and offender. And then, what do you need to get back to where you are, right? To be whole again. And that could be a whole bunch of things, right? But then the offender then has to take accountability. You could be, there's a wonderful author, thinker, Danielle Sered, who wrote a book called Until We Reckon. She runs an outfit in Brooklyn called Community Justice, it's a restorative justice program which deals with violent crimes. And because the restorative justice program that we did only dealt with first and second time nonviolent offenses. Well,
it becomes more touchy when you get into violent crime.
So that's the thing.
I don't want to minimize the work that your project was doing here, but the level of the
rubber hits the road
really
with violent crimes,
and
actually sexual crimes are a whole other level. But so I'd say two things. One is that what Danielle Sered said is that when she talks to a lot of the offenders who've gone through the program, what they have to do is take accountability, take responsibility for what they did. You could send somebody to prison for 20 years. They never have to admit for 1 second that they actually did something. They never have to take responsibility for it. And we know that, in Jewish tradition, Maimonides in the laws of repentance, laws of tshuva, says first thing you have to do is you have to admit that you did something, right? And in our caging system, putting somebody in a cage, they never have to admit it. I was wronged, and there are a lot of people who are in prison who shouldn't have been in prison. But bracketing that, people who did wrong could go through 10, 20 years of imprisonment and never have to take responsibility. And so they come out of prison more embittered and less in touch with what they did and less of who of a better person. Some people do improve in prison for other reasons. But so restorative justice enables and facilitates conversation between a survivor and an offender. Of course, the survivor has to agree to it, so that the offender can take responsibility for their actions and hear what the survivor needs in order to become whole again. Right? That is such a different process than the state prosecuting somebody and then caging them. And then the survivor is just, what about me? Right? And the survivor doesn't have to have anything to do with the process, except, so that's so.
Well,
so
there's a victims' rights movement,
but I feel
like they don't.
What the victims' rights
not
movement
really thinking in that way.
So, the victims' rights movement, one of their accomplishments was just a victim impact statement at a trial, which is after the trial. It's like the last thing. And then they could say, then they could finally tell the offender what happened, which is fine, which is great, and usually used in order to raise the sentence or whatever. But the problem is, and now there are some of the progressive DAs, our DA here in Los Angeles, George Gascon, 501c3, not shilling for George Gascon. But George Gascon is part of this progressive DA movement in which restorative justice is part of the process, right? There's a restorative justice office in the DA's office, so that it's not only at the end of the process as an afterthought, oh right, there's a victim, but rather the interaction has to be between the victim and the offender from the beginning.
As you said that they really only have an impact in the sentencing phase. They don't have any impact in the actual
right, and the charging trial. And also, and I mean, so many things that come to mind. I mean, the DA's office is a very powerful office, which a lot of people don't understand, because the DA makes the decisions about charging. So are police who abuse their power charged or not? In police, in what's euphemistically called officer-involved shootings, right? How are they involved? Because they shot somebody, right? To say officer shooting, right? So, but in officer-involved shootings, whether or not an officer will be charged under the previous DA, not a single officer. Well, one officer was charged in all her years, and so those things also create an atmosphere in the city of some people are just not touchable, right? And also distrust of the police, right? And the police distrust because the police are not actually policing. There's a very low clearance rate in the country. A rate, the clearance rate is the rate of when cases are brought to term either because they're solved or there's no chance of them being solved. But there's a very low clearance rate. Rape. There was a scandal here in Los Angeles where they found a whole warehouse full of rape kits that were untouched. Right? So when people say that, restorative justice, how are we going to get justice through restorative justice? How are you getting justice now? Right? Restorative justice at least is we're not doing everything right, so then if we change things, they'll go wrong. We're doing things wrong, so this might actually help us get to a place where there is justice for victims and justice for offenders. And so, it's again coming back to people do bad things. The question is the person a bad person because they did a bad thing? Are we going to judge people based on the worst day of their lives? Or are we going to say that there's a context for this, and that if we judge this person and put him away in jail, there's a victim over here who's also left dangling and with no closure, with no healing. And we could solve both of these problems at the same time by bringing victims and offenders together in a mediated conversation so that the victim can heal and the offender can take accountability and responsibility and then go on back to their family and community and become a productive member of society.
Well, I actually think this is not entirely unrelated to the going back to the issue of, the people who are unhoused, because very often when we're dealing with people who are unhoused, they're unhoused because they have a variety of issues which transcend merely the lack of a roof.
Right.
We have too many people who are homeless because of a lack of a roof, but Skid Row tends to attract people who have multiple reasons for being unhoused, and when we see them, they don't play very well. They're not making their best impression, and so like, are we going to see them and their lives in their entirety based on the impression that we get from them when they're on our street behaving in an altered manner? If that's the only way that we actually view them, we're sort of held down from imagining a better solution.
I agree with you, and I think that there are a lot of ways in which, and this maybe isn't my last point, that there is a grander problem which articulates itself in these smaller problems, and that is, we think the army solves everything. Now, by the army, I mean the army, police, ICE, border patrol. So in all of these situations, if at the borders we met refugees and asylum seekers with doctors and social workers, right, and pointed them, you know what, there's a city in Idaho, there's a city in Oregon, there's a city, this is where you could go, these are the services you need. Oh my God, that's what our country was founded on. If instead of police going out...
This is where there's a community that speaks your language.
Exactly, right? And so instead, what do? We have armed border patrol. And then if they get into the country, ICE. Why are armed officers responding to mental health crises? Because we don't have a mental health system that works. We should have mental health workers, and there are some cities who have tried this and it works. But when people so the slogan "defund the police," which I think is a good slogan, but some people think it's too big a leap. The first step is disarm the police. You don't need, every time a police officer comes into a situation with a gun, there's a criminologist who made a very smart statement. He said, the police have one move, which is or else, right? Make a left turn or else. Now the question is, what is the or else? Sit down or else. Go out, leave this, you're being disruptive, leave or else. Now, if you have a gun, you have one or else. If you don't have a gun, then you have to start thinking, what is your or else? Right? You have to speak. You have to use nonviolent, or you have to use non-armed methods. There are police in other countries that disarm people without shooting them. Right? If you have somebody in a mental health crisis, and your or else is a gun, so you're going into that situation to kill somebody. Right? Because that's your go-to. If you disarm the police and you don't send armed officers to mental health crises, to domestic disputes, to traffic accidents, right? What do you need somebody with a gun in a traffic accident? To to parking tickets. Get rid of the guns. Now, we do have a problem that there are so many guns in private hands. Fine, that's another problem. We have to solve that also. But you can't use that problem as an excuse for why you have so many armed police, because every time you put somebody with a gun into a situation, the situation escalates, right? And then you put on top of it racism and structural racism, the fact that when there's a mass shooting, all these white shooters walk away uninjured, but then you have these unarmed black folks who are being shot down in the street. It's not coincidental. But that again, take away the guns. Disarm the police. You saw the awful videos in Uvalde. You had 100 police officers armed to the teeth walking around doing nothing, while one 18-year-old or 17-year-old was killing people.
Yeah.
So,
well, Uvalde is an unusual place where law enforcement is the primary occupation.
Right. No, but I'm saying, but it's the tip of the iceberg in the sense that it shows in different ways what's going on. Well, why did UCLA have a tank? Right.
First, I've heard of that.
They were shamed into getting rid of it.
I haven't thought it through yet.
It was part of the Patriot Act program where the Army devolved all kinds of equipment down to
Well, I knew police departments did. I didn't know that.
But police departments who have this is going a little far afield, but all the images that came out of Ferguson with the police in combat fatigues and armed to the teeth. Actually, the way the LAPD used to be all the time, and with what they call the frog suits, that's because they're an occupying force. When I go to a lot of spaces where victims of police violence, or the family of victims of police violence speak. And a lot of times what they say is, where were you when my house was broken into? Where were you when we called you because somebody was stealing my car? So there are neighborhoods which are over-policed and underprotected. And those aren't the neighborhoods which I live in. But they're neighborhoods where police on every corner, and yet the crime rate is skyrocketing. On the other hand, you go to Beverly Hills, you go to West LA, you rarely see a police car. You only see them when their sirens are on, they're going someplace else. Right? But those neighborhoods are highly protected. Right? If anything happens, you know that there's a cop going to come. There's 90-second response time. Right? So why? That's part of the structure of the system. There are neighborhoods, low-income neighborhoods, black and brown neighborhoods, where they're underprotected but over-policed. And other neighborhoods that they're protected up the wazoo, but you don't see the cops. The cops are not harassing you. So in those neighborhoods which are overprotected under police, you have cops, you have stop and frisk, or whatever the current acceptable form of stop and frisk is. You have people being stopped for pretextual traffic stops. You have all these kind of things, right? Which always, and the New York Times had this horrific investigative report about how dangerous traffic stops were for the driver, right? In a situation where the cop can take a picture of the license plate and mail a ticket. Instead, he goes out because of the fact that your only or else is your gun. In a situation where disrespecting a cop, in a culture where disrespecting a police officer is considered, kind of on the Ten Commandments, then the cops go for the gun because they are trained to be warriors. We don't need warriors in the streets of our cities. Anyway.
Well, I just, our associate Carlos has been very patient with us. I think you've offered some specific actions, but I do think that we need to actually be thinking about how LA works and why there are these systematic issues. I'm not sure if we actually agree about it. We may actually disagree to a certain extent, but I feel that LA as a much more frustrating city in terms of being able to address these major issues. And I when I go to very large cities, I lived in San Francisco for a very long time, and I would go to a city like Chicago, and I would see that they had problems in Chicago, and I would see how big Chicago was, and I would say to myself, okay, well, they at least have this excuse. San Francisco has problems, and it's so rich that if they chose to solve them, they have all the resources that they could possibly use.
Right.
And LA seems to fall into this category of like very large cities where the question is, do we actually have the resources to solve this? And how do we get the resources to address things? Are there systematic, or I'm not sure if systematic is the ways that the system is constructed that make the problems more intractable because of a more atomized urban situation?
I'd say so. Yes. So I'd say two different things. One is that there is mere miles between areas where people are living 3 families to an apartment and areas where people are living 1 family to a 20-room mansion. Mere miles, right? And so that should be embarrassing. And so people are trying to, that is so the way to redress the fact that there isn't enough housing is by building housing, whether it's Housing LA, which is just a small tax on billionaires' incomes in order to build more housing, whether it's that the city government should take over empty buildings and turn them, become the lessor on these buildings and turn them into apartments. I mean, we have the resources. We are one of the richest cities in the world. And we are one of the poorest cities in the world. And so I think that you have to make the connection now. LA's political system, the fact that we have the county and the city, one over the other, it makes itself more complicated than it needs to be. But we have to elect people who are coming up. So things to do. Vote. Right? Find out who your city councilor is. Find out what their positions are on the issues on housing, on homelessness. Homelessness is now this awful 4818, which is homeless sweeps, where you're just taking people and basically moving them from one place to another. And in between moving them from one place to another, you're destroying all their property. So voting on that, voting on getting rid of vote out the sheriff and make sure we have a process, an impeachment in which we can keep the sheriff in check. In the state, there's the Vision Act, which is a proposition to a law that will make it illegal. Will prohibit. That's the word. Will prohibit jails from releasing people who have served their sentences to ICE to be deported, right? Which is basically sentencing people twice once they've served their sentence. And in the grander scheme of things, we have to keep pushing to totally reform our immigration laws. Totally. I mean, do something radical about the police, starting with disarming the police. Rethinking how we think about police in the city, defunding the police, and by that I mean moving money from this bloated police budget into social services, education, housing, mental health. And so when you go to the polls, think about all these things. Think about, this is why you're voting. Otherwise, you are objectively guilty, even though you're subjectively innocent.
So I actually had a conversation with my neighbor about this last night, and he asked a specific question, which I think I'll let you answer, and we'll call it a day. The question is, this answer works for you because it's founded in Jewish texts, and the hold of the Jewish texts has on you is that, you know, we're in a covenantal relationship with God, who's the source of Torah, and so like that's like the, you know, the thing that holds the power of obligation. So is this something that you hoped people beyond the part of the Jewish community which actually accepts this kind of obligation out of faith, because that's not the entire Jewish religious community, and it's certainly not part of the entire Jewish community, and the obligations, in the Jewish sense of Jewish law, the obligations that are on Jews are not obligations for people who are not Jews. So like how applicable and how persuasive were you hoping that this would be outside of the specific community for which it really, I mean, I feel that the people who subscribe to the idea that Jewish law is an obligation really should be convinced by your argument, the way you make it. I don't. That's not the question. We don't need to deal with them. Let's talk about everybody else.
So yeah, that's a good question. So as you know from having memorized my book, I don't talk about beliefs in the book. I don't have a superstructure of covenantal obligation. And the reason is because what I want to get from the textual tradition, from Rabbinic Judaism, is a framework for thinking about justice, right? Not for thinking about obligation. That's a whole other thing. And if we wanted to have a conversation about obligation, some of the assumptions you made about what I believe or don't believe, I probably would take issue with. But this book, what I'm hoping this book shows is that the rabbinic sources actually have a framework for thinking about justice, which is equally compelling for religious and non-religious people, equally compelling for Jews and Christians. And I was for a long time I was on the board of an organization called CLU, Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice, and for a while I was the president of the board, or I forgot what we call it, chair of the board, whatever we call it, and co-chair, and their motto is all religions believe in justice. Now, I've often said to people there, and it was a great multi-faith, it was also a multiracial organization, but it was a great multi-faith organization, and I often said to people, you know, one day we ought to sit down and just duke it out around theology just for fun, right? Because, you know, you had people from, you know, who were Catholics, evangelicals, Muslims, Sunni, Shia, Jews, Reform, conservative, but a framework around justice. And I think what I'm trying to articulate in this book and conceptualize is a framework of what a just city demands from us as residents in the city, right? Now, it is written in a language that's taken from the cornerstone religious texts of our tradition. And if you want to add on that a layer of religious obligation, that's great. You know, I feel an obligation. But I don't think you need the layer of religious obligation in order to understand the internal coherence of the argument that I'm making.
No, I mean, I do find the argument coherent, and I would recommend the book, which you know, other people can read the book and make their own decision about it. But I actually found it to be for say, academic Jewish text, very accessible, much more accessible than one would sadly expect from someone holding an academic position. It's like if you're going to disagree with this book, I think you'll be able to at least understand what you're disagreeing with, and it's unlikely that it will be the sort of book that one responds to by throwing it against the wall, which is an appropriate response for some books.
Right, it's true.
For some people more than others, but why don't I'm going to give you the last word, whatever you can think of, and then we'll call it a day.
Well, first I want to thank you for inviting me here, for hosting me, for Ternista, for Carlos. Sorry.
Sorry, we have a in our regular orbit, we have Carlos and Carlitos, so it's a challenge.
Thank you, Carlos. I do want to say that I think that I'm very glad that we're having this conversation, because I do think that this conversation is very important, because from the conversation, as the rabbis say, Gadol Talmud, Talmud mevi lidei maseh. Great is the study, because study leads to action. And I am hoping that this study, deep study and thought about these issues, will lead people to action, so that we will create a more just city.
Kein Hirat Son.